Welcome to Cogent Technology TV. In today's episode we're going to have a look at the data requirements which we request from our customers. Hopefully in today's episode you'll see some bits of information which you'll find useful, and the idea is that if you follow our recommendations we should be asking you less questions during the processing of your job, and hopefully it'll reduce the opportunities for error occurring during the manufacturing of your product. First of all, a few things are applicable to all the information that we require from you. Our preference is to receive your data in an electronic format, not on paper. And that format can either be a native CAD, a PDF document, or a Word or Excel document. Each document should have a unique identifier of its name, its version or revision, depending on what controls you have on it. Preferably not to be using the date as a revision, as this can quite easily be misunderstood. And customers should also update the versions on their documentations if they've provided us documentation for quotation purposes only, even if there's been only very minor changes made between the quotation stage and us coming to manufacture your product. So on to the actual documentation itself. The first and most important bit of information we need is your bill of materials, or BOM. Again, we prefer this in an electronic format. Our preference is Microsoft Excel or similar spreadsheet, as this we find is much more easily editable and importable into our pre-production processes. The bill of materials has to contain enough information for us to be able to build your product, so circuit references, description for each line, quantities, and if possible a supplier or manufacturer part number, but if your descriptions are very detailed it may be that the manufacturer's part number is contained within there. One additional bit of information which can be very useful is to include your own customer part number or unique reference for each line item on your BOM, as this can be useful when we're corresponding in terms of identifying an individual part which we need to query. Plus it can also be used when we're cross-referencing separate jobs from the same client to look for common components across the two jobs. And finally, on the bill of materials, if you can include a list of all the parts which are not fitted to your assembly, this can save time and queries in knowing what parts you intentionally don't want fitted to your PCB assembly. The next piece of information which we need from the client is to have some PCB manufacturing data, usually in the form of Gerber files. These need to include a specification document for the PCB, whether it be included in the Gerber files themselves or it may be supplied as a separate text or Word document, and this should include such things as the colour of the PCB resist, the colour of the PCB legend, the thickness of the PCB, if it's not standard FR4 type PCB material, the material of the PCB itself, and also the plating finish which you'd prefer to be used on your PCBs. In addition to that, it's sometimes useful, depending on your final application, if there are areas of the PCB periphery where breakout protrusions aren't permitted due to it fitting into an enclosure of some description. If you could highlight those on the Gerber files or on a separate drawing, that could be useful to us, and again save us having to ask the question. Along with your PCB Gerber files, we'd require some form of placement files for our surface mount placement machines. Traditionally those would have been a centroid data file, which is just a text file containing the X, Y coordinates and rotations for your PCB, but in these modern days this is very limited of use to us, as it still needs a lot of manual interpretation to finish the program into a useful machine program. As you can see from the pictures that we're showing on your screen, it clearly shows where the component is, but we've got no idea of what the component looks like or its orientation. If you can supply to us ASCII CAD data, the most common universal formats being GenCAD or ODB++, when we import this data into our front-end systems, we actually see a representation of the PCB with components which look just like they appear in your original CAD. So therefore we don't need to have queries about rotations. The rotation we see on our screen and see on our placement machines is exactly the rotation you intended to have for that component, and therefore eliminates one area for misinterpretation in importing your data. The other benefit of importing the CAD from ASCII is that we get to see the PCB outline, so we can make sure that the size of the PCB that we've got in our data is correct, again compared to the Gerbers. If you're using our fast track PCB prototype service, one piece of information which we will require from you is a placement drawing for your PCB showing the placement, orientation and circuit reference of each of the components on your PCB. As commonly on high density PCBs, this information may not be complete on the legend, so we ask that you provide a placement drawing which highlights the circuit references and clearly identifies the rotations of all components which have polarity. This is particularly important for things like surface mount diodes and surface mount capacitors, as quite often on the PCB legend the orientation marker will just be conventionally a straight line at one end on an LED or diode, usually denoting the cathode, and on a capacitor conversely it would generally denote the negative side of the capacitor. If your PCBs aren't following these conventions, it can be useful on the placement drawing to actually add the letter K or A to denote which is the anode and cathode, or sometimes it's even possible to actually draw the diode arrow symbol on as a reference to remove any room for misinterpretation. If you're requiring us to purchase any mechanical parts, whether they be heat sinks or enclosures or parts of a similar nature to that, we would ask that you provide us with a 2D mechanical CAD drawing or a PDF export from mechanical CAD, in order that we can first use that to purchase the correct parts from our suppliers. But even if you're free issuing those parts, we still ask for the drawings, as it's useful for us to be able to inspect those parts that our goods in, and we'd need a drawing for reference purposes. Finally, if we're testing your product or even just performing programming of onboard devices, we'd require information from you for these. These would generally be in the form of circuit diagrams if we're testing, some form of test instruction, and also a functional description of how the circuit itself works and what the functionality should be, and of course the all-important firmware files for the devices we're wanting to program. And in a lot of cases it's good for it to send through the option fuse maps as well, for things like brownout detection, write protect and clocks, as sometimes these aren't always held in the binary files that are sent for programming the device. Hopefully some of this information was useful to you. For more detailed information, we do have a manufacturing data requirements document which is available for download on our website. Thank you for watching, and I hope to see you on the next episode.